Imagine standing in the middle of a May morning in 1471. Mist still clings to the damp fields of western England. In front of you stretch open meadows broken by thick hedgerows and narrow streams winding around the town of Tewkesbury. In the distance, the tower of Tewkesbury Abbey rises like a cold landmark against the grey sky. But that morning was not an ordinary morning. Two armies were moving toward each other. On one side stood the army of King Edward of, the Yorkist king who had just returned to England after a period of exile, and was reclaiming his throne by the sword. On the other side were the Lancastrian forces loyal to Queen Margaret of Anjou and Prince Edward of Westminster, the last hope of the House of Lancaster. If this battle were lost, the Lancastrian dynasty would almost disappear from the political board of England. Yet there was something strange about the situation. The Lancastrian army had been pushed into a position with almost no route of retreat. They stood among muddy streams and thick woods, with the town of Tewkesbury behind them. One small mistake and the entire army could be crushed. So why had they chosen this position? Why did Edward of, known as a bold and aggressive commander, decide to attack immediately after marching through the night? And what happened during the few short hours that followed that turned Tewkesbury into one of the most decisive battles of the Wars of the Roses? Let us sit down and imagine a map of the battlefield in front of us. If you can, pour yourself a cup of hot coffee, because from this moment onward everything will move very quickly, very chaotically, and with extreme brutality. Now we begin. The morning of May 4, 1471, on the night before the battle, the Lancastrian army under Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, had marched for many exhausting hours trying to escape the pursuit of Edward of. Their plan was to cross the River Severn and move into Wales, where they hoped to gather more support. But as they approached Tewkesbury, they discovered that the bridge over the river was already controlled by the Yorkists. There was no choice left. Somerset was forced to stop and prepare for battle. The position chosen by the Lancastrians lay south of the town of Tewkesbury. It was slightly elevated ground. In front of it stretched open fields broken by small streams and marshy ground known as the Gastons. Thick hedgerows and patches of woodland formed natural barriers. Somerset believed the terrain could protect his flanks. He deployed his army in 3 divisions. The left wing was commanded by Somerset himself and included many knights and heavy infantry. The center was led by Lord Wenlock, an experienced commander. Prince Edward, only 17 years old, stood there as well with his personal guard. The right wing was under John Courtenay, Earl of Devon. Behind the army lay woodland and the town of Tewkesbury. If they lost, the retreat would be chaotic. Around dawn on May 4, the army of Edward had finally appeared to the south. They had marched nearly 60 kilometers in 24 hours to catch their enemy. Edward understood clearly. If the Lancastrians escaped into Wales, the war might continue for many more years, so he decided to attack immediately. The Yorkist army was also divided into 3 main bodies. The right wing was commanded by William Hastings, one of the king's most trusted commanders. The center was led by Edward of himself. The king was tall, wearing bright armor and riding among his household guard. The left wing was commanded by Richard, Duke of Gloucester, Edward's younger brother. This young man would later become Richard I. At that moment he was only about 18 years old, yet already an experienced battlefield commander. The distance between the 2 armies was only a few hundred meters. The battle opened with artillery and archers. English longbowmen, famous since the days of Agincourt, began firing long volleys of arrows into the enemy formations. The sharp sound of arrows cutting through the air echoed again and again. Field guns, small but loud, also began to fire, but the marshy terrain made movement difficult for both sides. The 2 armies almost stood still, shooting at each other across the fields. While observing the Yorkist lines, Somerset noticed something. The Yorkist left wing under Richard of Gloucester stood close to a woodland. Part of their formation was partly hidden by the trees. Somerset believed that if he launched a surprise attack from the forest, he could collapse the Yorkist flank. If that happened, the entire army of Edward might break. It was an opportunity, but it was also a gamble. Somerset immediately ordered his knights and infantry to move secretly through the woodland to prepare an ambush. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Edward was also watching. He began to notice movement among the trees. Just one more moment and the Battle of Tewkesbury would explode into full chaos. In the tense minutes before the real fighting erupted, the battlefield south of Tewkesbury fell almost silent for a brief moment. The 2 armies faced each other across damp fields, thick hedgerows, and narrow streams cutting through the ground. Archers on both sides continued to fire probing volleys, but the main formations had not yet collided. On the Lancastrian left, Somerset was preparing his gamble. He did not want to wait any longer. If they remained exchanging arrows and artillery fire, the Yorkist army, encouraged by its recent victories, might gradually push forward and break his line. Somerset needed a sudden blow, a breakthrough that could shake the entire enemy front. The small woodland between the two armies was the key. Hidden beneath the trees, Somerset gathered several thousand of his best troops. Armored knights, infantry carrying long spears, and a number of archers. They moved quietly along narrow forest paths, trying to avoid detection by the Yorkists. The ground beneath their feet was wet and muddy. In many places the hedges were so thick that soldiers had to cut their way through with knives. But Somerset urged them forward quickly. He wanted the attack to strike the Yorkist flank before Edward could react. Meanwhile, on the other side of the battlefield, Edward continued to observe from the center of his formation. The king was known for his ability to read the battlefield quickly. The faint movements in the forest made him suspicious. Edward ordered several units of archers and light cavalry to move toward the woodland on the left flank to investigate. This decision came only minutes after Somerset had begun his movement. Around mid-morning, Somerset gave the order to attack. From the forest, hundreds of Lancastrian soldiers suddenly surged out from beneath the trees. They rushed toward the Yorkist left wing where Gloucester forces stood. War horns sounded. Battle cries tore through the air. Lancastrian knights spurred their horses across the grass, lowering their lances. Infantry followed behind with shields and axes raised. The first blow truly shook the field. Part of the Yorkist line was caught off guard. Several front-line units were pushed back dozens of meters. Lancastrian spears pierced through shield lines, and the fight quickly turned into brutal close combat. Gloucester, barely 18 years old, immediately tried to stabilize his line. He rode along the front, shouting orders and urging the soldiers to hold their ground. Somerset continued to press the attack. He knew he had to break this flank quickly. But after only a few minutes of fighting, a serious problem began to appear. The terrain ahead was not as favorable as Somerset had believed. Small streams and the marshy Gastons cut across the advance. Some Lancastrian knights became stuck in the mud and were forced to dismount. The charging formation began to stretch apart. Units at the front moved too far ahead, while those behind were still trapped between the woods and the marsh. At that moment the Yorkist scouts appeared. Yorkist archers quickly took positions along the edge of the woodland. A dense storm of arrows began falling onto the Lancastrian formations. Long arrows pierced through armor gaps, struck shields, and buried themselves in the muddy ground. Confusion began to spread through Somerset forces. Edward realized the decisive moment had arrived. He immediately ordered a counterattack. From the Yorkist center, several units of heavy infantry and cavalry moved quickly to support Gloucester. They advanced across the fields and struck directly into the flank of Somerset's trapped force. Now the situation reversed completely. Instead of striking the Yorkist flank, Somerset's army was caught between two directions. In front stood Gloucester troops holding their ground. On the side came fresh Yorkist units from Edward's center. Yorkist archers continued firing from the woodland edge, throwing the Lancastrian formations into deeper confusion. Somerset's bold attack was turning into a deadly trap. Lancastrian units in the front began to be pushed backward. Yorkist cavalry counterattacked fiercely, driving them back into the forest. Among the trees, the fighting became chaotic. Swords, axes, and spears clashed within only a few steps of distance. Some Lancastrian soldiers panicked and fled. The retreat quickly spread to other units. Somerset tried to rally his men, but the terrain made it almost impossible. In less than an hour after the attack began, the Lancastrian left wing had been driven back. The survivors ran toward their original positions, straight into the center of their own army. And this moment triggered an even greater disaster for the entire Lancastrian force. When Somerset units were driven out of the woodland and began running back toward the main formation, the battlefield south of Tewkesbury shook with a wave of chaos. Lancastrian soldiers fled without formation. They rushed across grass fields, splashed through streams, and crashed into the center of their own army, where Lord Wenlock was trying to hold the line around Prince Edward. For the first few minutes Wenlock did not understand what was happening. From a distance he saw groups of soldiers running back from the left wing. Behind them came Yorkist units pursuing closely. But Somerset understood perfectly what had happened. His attack had failed. Not only failed, it had shattered the entire Lancastrian left wing. Somerset rode furiously toward the center. He was so enraged that he almost lost control. In front of him stood Lord Wenlock, who had kept his troops in their defensive position instead of advancing to support the attack. According to many contemporary accounts, Somerset believed Wenlock had hesitated or even betrayed him. His anger exploded in the middle of the battlefield. Somerset rode up to Wenlock and in a burst of rage struck him in the head with his battle axe. Lord Wenlock collapsed on the spot. The death of one of the central commanders in the middle of the battle pushed the Lancastrian army into even greater confusion.
Edward could see all of this disorder from the center of the Yorkist line. He understood that the decisive moment had arrived.
The king ordered a full attack along the entire front. Yorkist horns sounded across the battlefield. From the center, heavy infantry began advancing across the fields, shields raised high, spears pointed forward. Yorkist knights rode behind them, ready to strike into the widening gaps in the enemy line. The Yorkist right wing under William Hastings also began to move forward. At the same time, Gloucester forces pushed down from the woodland against the collapsing Lancastrian left. The Lancastrian army was now under attack from 3 directions. The Lancastrian center tried to hold. Knights guarding Prince Edward formed a shield line and fought desperately. Archers behind them fired their final volleys into the advancing Yorkists. But the situation could no longer be saved. Units retreating from the left wing crashed through the center, breaking apart the already strained formation. Some soldiers turned and fled toward the town. Others tried to retreat toward Tewkesbury Abbey. When the Yorkists struck the center, the battle quickly turned into a massacre. Yorkist knights charged directly into the Prince Guard. Spears and swords clashed at extremely close range. Men who fell were trampled into the mud and blood. Within a short time the central defense collapsed. When the Lancastrian formation finally broke apart, soldiers scattered across the fields. Some tried to cross the Gaston streams, but many became stuck in the marsh and were caught by Yorkist pursuers. Other groups ran toward Tewkesbury Abbey hoping to find refuge inside the monastery. But the Yorkist soldiers pursued relentlessly. The battle was no longer a clash between 2 armies, it had become a hunt. The fields south of the town quickly filled with bodies. Amid the chaos, Prince Edward of Westminster, the only heir of the House of Lancaster, was captured. There are different accounts of his final moments. Some sources claim he was taken alive and brought before Edward IV. When asked why he had dared to rebel against the king, the young prince is said to have answered defiantly. Soon after he was killed. Other accounts say he was killed on the battlefield during the fighting. Either way, the death of Prince Edward ended the final hope of the House of Lancaster. The Battle of Tewkesbury lasted only a few hours, but its consequences were enormous. Most Lancastrian leaders were killed or captured. Somerset, who had launched the attack, was captured after the battle and executed only a few days later. Many Lancastrian nobles were beheaded at Tewkesbury. Queen Margaret, mother of Prince Edward, was taken prisoner. On the fields south of the town, thousands of Lancastrian soldiers lay dead. This victory completely secured the power of Edward IV. Only a few weeks later, the deposed Lancastrian king, Henry V, also died in the Tower of London. With those 2 events, the House of Lancaster nearly disappeared from the stage of English power. And the short but ferocious battle at Tewkesbury became the decisive finishing blow of the early phase of the Wars of the Roses.